All right, so thanks everybody so much for coming to this particular panel called Curiosity, Equity, and Education. Really excited to share it with my co-panelists, Christina Leon from Princeton University and Arjun Shankar from Georgetown University today. We want to get started by just sort of prefacing the subject of curiosity by saying that it's a word we throw around a lot, and it's I think a cornerstone to all of our pedagogies, and yet it's a term most faculty, including ourselves, don't fully understand. And I think there's really rich resources for thinking through curiosity and thinking about curiosity specifically in relationship to equity when we enter the classroom. And that's the kind of conversation that we want to foster here today. We want to, in the background of all of this, I'll sort of let folks kind of introduce themselves in a moment, but in the background of all of this, we come together as collaborators on a project called Curiosity Studies, which is a book that we recently released, and I want to give you just a screen share here of Curiosity Studies. This is published on an open access website through Manifold and the University of Minnesota. You can see the entire book here. You can read through it in different sections. And what's kind of delightful as well is that we've also published a series of podcast episodes to go along with each of the chapters that tackle curiosity in relationship here, as you see, to the scientific enterprise, to relearning how we learn. So that's more of the education section. Reimagining how we relate to one another socially, and also deconstructing the status quo. So the whole book is here. There are nice contributor profiles you can read. You can listen to the podcast episodes, and it's just kind of an exciting online project that if you're thinking about curiosity in your classrooms, this would be a really nice thing to use. The whole website itself, if you choose to and kind of develop or open an account on the website, which is just your name and a password, you can host annotated readings with your students of different chapters. They can interact with the multimedia website sources. It's just kind of a cool, nifty way to have published a thing about curiosity. You can engage with the project itself more curiously. So that's what brings us together. I'm Perry Zurin. I'm at American University. I study political philosophy specifically, and how that applies to transformation and change, social change, around curiosity, around political resistance, and around gender, specifically transgender experience. I'll kick it to Christina, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. And thank you to everyone who's put in the infrastructure to make this Zoom situation possible for us. I know there are a lot of players and folks whose names I don't even know to thank. So thank you very much. And thank you for showing up. I'm Christina Leon. I'm assistant professor of English at Princeton University, and I work specifically on hemispheric American literatures with a focus on Latinx, Caribbean literatures, as well as queer theory, feminist theory, and performance studies.
Arjun?
I'm Arjun Shankar. I'm an assistant professor in the Culture and Politics program at Georgetown University, and my primary focus is in thinking about the help economies and racialization processes associated with that in South Asia and in India in particular. But I also come to the university as a critical pedagogue. I was a 9th grade biology teacher before I came back to get my PhD in anthropology and education. So I'm thinking a lot about these questions about what curiosity is or isn't for us as educators in the classroom.
Arjun and I are the co-editors of the book Curiosity Studies, and we want to just give you kind of a slice of why we did that project to begin with before we jump into short presentations and then a larger discussion afterward. First of all, we noticed that, I mean, especially with Arjun's experience in the classroom in K through 12, and obviously all of us have been in K through 12 classrooms in one way or another, we noticed that curiosity is typically treated as some feeling that some of us have more of or less of, and we just have curious students or we don't have curious students. Sometimes curiosity gets kind of squashed and sometimes it doesn't. And the way that people kind of approach this topic doesn't fully appreciate, we think, the multiplicity of the ways in which curiosity is expressed. So really thinking about, especially across neuroatypical and kind of learning differences, how is it that we express our curiosity in a classroom setting? How are especially marginalized students, how is their curiosity missed? How many ways is their curiosity missed? So we think that curiosity is more multiple than we realize and more social and political than we realize, because it's precisely our social and political values that tend to inform how we recognize interest in a subject, and also what subjects we think are interesting and our students should also be interested in. So that's kind of the broader, kind of a certain frustration with how curiosity has been thought and how it needs to be thought more multiply and more socially and politically. That was what inspired the book, and that has specific implications for education. Arjun, do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, I'll just briefly say, we can distill some of what Perry said to a couple questions, and the primary one being, what are the constraints on curiosity for students and what facilitates curiosity? What social, cultural, and political and economic processes actually shape who can be curious about what and when? And so if we follow those kinds of questions, we come to a very different kind of politics of curiosity in our classrooms, which we're arguing, at least for the purposes of this presentation and in our broader work, is as important for those in the natural sciences as it is for those in the humanities and the social sciences. Oftentimes, we get sort of conversations that have to do with the social and political get cordoned off to one set of professors. But we actually think that these questions ought to be asked by those across the disciplines. And when we do that, it actually might allow us to attend to a different kind of cultivation of curiosity for ourselves and our students. And so if we keep that in mind as we go into these presentations, it might help focus what we're hearing during each of our talks. And I guess with that, what I'll do is I'll pass it to Perry. I think the order here is going to be Perry and then Christina, and then I'll do the last presentation. They'll each be about 10 minutes long.
Great, thanks. I'm going to go back into screen share here. So my remarks today, I want to focus on the subject of questioning our questions and how this helps us tackle the transformative, or appreciate the transformative power of curiosity. All questions come from somewhere and go someplace. They slip off some things and stick to other things. They move the world in one way and not another. All questions. This is part of why I believe curiosity is inherently a social practice and inherently has political stakes, because it's always doing something and it's always coming from somewhere. I want to take a step back and steal a bit from the theories of hope around the world. There's a little bit of a correlation between curiosity and hope. I think it's fun to think about them together. Alan Middleman argues that there are two kinds of hope. One is emancipatory and one is conserving. Most of the time we think about hope as an emancipatory practice. It's something that will get us free. We hope for something better. But he also argues it's essentially conserving too. He says hope's not always about change. It is also about conserving the practices and institutions that support meaning, which have been inherited from the past and still endure in the present. I think it's really helpful to think about curiosity in precisely this kind of language. We can think about two kinds of curiosity: a conserving curiosity and a curiosity for change. The conserving curiosity is one that builds on traditions and histories and canons and disciplines and methods that we've inherited. Unanswered questions that we and our predecessors have had and we still want to ask. And these kinds of questions are also the ones that sustain current projects. There may be really powerful current projects we want to sustain, and we need a curiosity that's going to sustain those. It's going to ask the new questions down that line. Those projects, those relations, and those structures. But there's also a kind of curiosity that's built to change things. And you can think of Kuhn's revolutionary science, so normal science versus revolutionary science, really sets up a new paradigm. This is also the kind of curiosity that I think is coming from and practiced for those who've been silenced or marginalized in the academy in general, or in disciplines in particular. This is the kind of curiosity that lends itself to innovations and creation, new questions, deconstructing the current projects that exist and saying, no, we need something new. And in education, in all of our fields, in all of our classrooms, we're teaching both kinds of curiosity implicitly, right? We're teaching this is a way to ask questions in this field. We've inherited it, it's good. These are the questions we still haven't asked, but we're kind of holding on to from the past, let's go get them. But also, there's some new ideas out there, right? And bring your new ideas, and let's see what we can do together. This is something that Fred Moten argues both of these are essential to the project of the Freedom Schools. So he says, Freedom Schools asked two questions. What do we have that we need to keep, right? What do we have that we need to keep, hold on to? But what do we not have that we need? Both questions are important. I think Anzaldúa emphasizes this as well. She says, as she presses toward what she calls new aesthetic consciousness, which is a borderland consciousness that she specifically locates in the US-Mexico border and in beings who are liminal in some way. She says that consciousness begins by taking inventory of all the things that we've inherited, questions we've inherited, the beliefs we've inherited, and in some cases holding on to them, and in some cases consciously rupturing from them, so as to create new perspectives. So a lot of her work is forward-looking, a lot of it is pulling new resources from the past that have been looked over. So our job as educators, and this is just sort of the really basic thought I want to propose for you today, is to help students to recognize what questions do in the world, where they stick, where they're headed, and where they're coming from. I think that's fundamentally something we're already doing, but we don't always think about our practice, our pedagogical practice as doing that. Our job is also to help students ask old questions that they haven't learned how to ask. We, as professors who've been trained in something that extends far beyond us, right? We get to say, here's some old stuff. Let's tackle it in every field, but also new questions that they can't even imagine. And this, I think the last part is the most important. We're here to help students decide when it's time to let some things lie, to let go of some questions, and when it's time to hold on tight. Because they're going to, they go off, they do their thing, they're going to leave the world well past when we're here. And they're going to have to be able to assess, to make this decision on an everyday basis. What are the questions we got to keep, we got to hold on to, we got to conserve? And what are the questions we need to ask for change? What are those things? Our job is also to learn from our students, to ask old questions we've forgotten how to ask, and to ask new questions we can't even anticipate. So part of my work is thinking about the politics of curiosity sort of in general in the classroom.
Harry, you have a little crackling going on your speaker, and we're just getting a couple of chats on that, so we want to test that.
Okay. Is it still there? All right. All right, so our job is to learn from them, right? And so part of the work I've been doing is thinking about student protests. What, still going?
Do you have a mic on your clothing in any way?
No, I don't.
I was just wondering if you were more high tech than I could even understand. Okay.
All right. I'll just leave you with this slide. Maybe I'll leave you with this slide. Curiosity is a restless questioning that as a moment of attention, suggestion, and vigilance constitutes an integral phenomenon of being alive. There can be no creativity without the curiosity that moves us and sets us patiently impatient before a world that we did not make, to add to it something of our own making. Students want that. They are patiently impatient before a world they did not make. And if we can equip them to enter that world critically, thoughtfully, about the questions they want to hold on to and the questions they need to begin and set up, then I think we've done our job. So with that, I'll hand it over to Christina.
Thank you, Perry. Let me see if I can share my screen now. Share. Okay. I apologize for everybody having to see me do this. Okay. So, can everybody hear me okay? Am I crackling or anything? Just make a lot of waving if anything gets weird, which it might. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about today was really the genesis of this chapter that I wrote for the excellent project that Perry and Arjun had put together. And when I was asked to do the chapter, to be honest with you, I didn't know what curiosity studies was. And Perry said, great, we're figuring it out, which was wonderful. So the thing that occurred to me first when I was approached about contributing to this is to put it in conversation with my current book project, which looks at the question of ethics in addition to the question of politics, specifically in relation to Latino representation. And what I mean by that is just the massive amounts of information that we have now about Latinos and Latinidad. Latinidad is just a way of thinking hemispherically about Latino-ness, being Latinx in the Americas. And one of the things that I was most interested in is sort of one of the challenges that I face often in the classroom, which is that my students have already been trained before they come into the classroom about how to be curious about sociological and demographic difference. And I'm really happy for that. And it also presents a lot of challenges insofar as a lot of the students come in hoping that they get the answer right immediately, hoping that they won't be canceled for saying something wrong, or hoping that they are going to get some sort of entry point into thinking about these different minority cultures, and specifically Latinx, Latina, and Latino cultures. So one of the difficulties, this was heightened for me when I was assigned at my first tenure track position, a course called Literature of American Minorities in 10 weeks. There was no time cap on it. It was just 10 weeks, all American minorities and all of their literature. And I was really concerned about the possibility that the students would come in thinking that in 10 weeks they were going to learn everything they needed to know about American minorities. And what I did instead to shift the sort of focus of the class and what I developed within this chapter was a way of thinking about the fact that this is still a literary classroom, and literary studies has a pretty strong relationship to thinking about how representation works. So when I did this, I was thinking, how do we develop an ethical approach to cultivating a curious way of dealing with or interacting with aesthetics, or with artwork, with literature, etc., rather than taking it as sociological data, which is a disciplinary difference, right? How could we actually stay within the realm of the literary or the aesthetic? Because what's interesting for me there is that the literary or the aesthetic is less about verifiable fact and more about how we encounter or how we relate to something that is unfolding as we're reading, which in many ways is actually the scene of ethical relation. So that's a bit of the background for this particular chapter that I looked at. In relation to the specificity of the work that I do in Latino studies, this has a pretty interesting kind of case study to it, insofar as a lot of Latino studies theorists have been talking for some time now about how there's an increasing burden of representation, right? So that anytime anybody writes a Latino novel, it's supposed to give some sort of thorough voice and agency and narrative where there was not one prior. That's a huge undertaking for any novel, of course. And then again, we're in the quagmire of the fact that it's fiction. It's not a sociological long-form journalistic approach to history or anything of that sort. So a lot of the work that I'm doing is thinking about how difficult it is to be a minoritarian or minority cultural producer, right? Because you're often in a situation where you are either telling how horrible things have been, how wrong things have been, or you're paving a way open for like a liberatory future. And there's a lot of the ways in which when that happens, you aren't allowed to be in the present. You aren't allowed to be nuanced or complex. So how does this interface with curiosity? So one of the things that I'm thinking, or one of the people, the sort of clamorous, amazing voices that I'm thinking with are Edward Glissant, who wrote Poetics of Relation, and he's an Afro-Caribbean philosopher, and he said, we clamor for the right to opacity for everyone. Cristina Beltran is a regular contributor to, I believe, MSNBC and some other major news outlets, but she's an NYU professor. And she works on she has a book called The Trouble with Unity. And it's basically about how Latino, the sort of creation of this pan-ethnic category that's relatively new has resulted in a kind of homogenization of what Latino can mean. And so she writes in her book, characterizing a subject as either Hispanic or Latino as an exercise in opacity. And then a queer theorist, Nicholas de Villiers, makes this other claim. I would like to allow for the possibility of non-meaning and non-knowledge as queer strategies. That's what I'm calling queer opacity. So one of the things that I'm thinking through is if we aren't going to put this burden of representation onto minority cultural producers or to the text or the artwork that we work on, how do we then sustain a relation in the classroom, a curious relation, but one that isn't interested in the curiosity that Perry had been talking about in the first presentation, a curiosity that is inherently conservative insofar as it's trying to conserve a tradition. And that tradition, at least in literary studies, if we take that as the case in point, is the tradition has not accommodated for Latino letters. And we can see this in the fact that my position as a professor of Latino literature and culture would not have been available 20 years ago. In fact, when I was applying for PhDs, I applied for a PhD in comparative literature because so many of the English departments didn't even have a Christina in them for me to study with, right? So these things are ongoing, and that's why curiosity, I think, is so important to think about with ethics, because it is, as Perry was saying, processual, right? It's ongoing, it's an affect, it's also a mode of learning, but it's a mode of learning that's been learned. And so if students have learned that there's 1 month dedicated to Hispanic heritage, 1 month dedicated to Black history, or to women's history, or something like that, then they're already trained within what we might call a weak multiculturalism, right? Where they're coming into the classroom and they know that there's a right and a wrong way to go about things. They understand that certain words are not right, but the emphasis on getting it right often stops them from engaging with what's before them, with the text that's actually before them. So for some reason, my computer isn't working. Now it is. So I am thinking here with Doris Summers, who says worry should be part of the work if we learn to read the distance written into some ethnically marked literature. A variety of rhetorical moves can hold a reader at arm's length or joke at their pretense of master in order to propose something different than knowledge. So here I'm thinking a little bit about slowing students down in the classroom rather than expecting them to learn in a way that models certain kind of forms of learning that would accrue into more and more masterful knowledge. I think a curious pedagogy that stays ethically open is one that cultivates a series of questions, as Perry had been gesturing toward, right? And this is particularly important, I think, in marginalized discourses. Antonio Villego is another really amazing theorist of Latino studies. And if you're not interested in this, you know, this is just a little bit of a blip about where this is coming from for me in a scholarly way. But he makes this amazing claim in this book called Dead Subjects Towards a Politics of Loss in Latino Studies, which is not as grave as it sounds. But he says there must be much less pretension to understanding in this regard, since ethnic racialized subjectivity has suffered from too much understanding. This is not to say that ethnic racialized subjectivity and experience has been understood, but rather to say that the project of understanding it is imagined as completely within reach. And again, we can think about this insofar as if you have 1 month versus the entire calendar year to think about one demographic, there's a kind of scalar difference there, a kind of shortened consumerist approach to the ways in which we're thinking about difference. So again, I turn to Edward Glissant, because for me, curiosity, if we're going to keep it open and we're going to keep it away from some of the legacies that curiosity has, right? Because curiosity as a practice in Western culture really comes from travel literature, which is part and parcel of colonization, right? So there are ways in which curiosity has been used as a colonial project, and we can see this because our museums are full of objects that are not proper to the people who own the museums, or proper to the people who paid for the museums, or proper to the people who patron the museums, right? We can think about it in that regard. And so I'm interested with Glissant in thinking about opacity, which for me is a form of humility in the face of what we don't know, or in the face of, it's an alternative to a kind of masterful pedagogy. So one of the things that I'm interested in the classroom is cultivating curiosity with opacity as an ethically attendant term. And the reason for that is to allow for the relational space of curiosity to really flourish, allow for the errancy, and for students to have their little rabbit holes in their mind not be squashed within the demands of a semester or the demands of sort of like knowledge projection. And so with Glissant, he says here, the thrust of the world and its desire no longer embolden you onward in a fever of discovery. So rather than making like a lot of Christopher Columbuses in our classrooms, he says opacity can multiply you all around, right? So instead of seeing difference as this hard and fast border, he's interested in how not knowing another, not knowing the full story, actually keeps that relational and ethical space alive. And I had a little bit more, but I think I'm going to end it right there. Thank you. Let me stop my sharing.
So I know I'm up. I'm just going to share my screen very quickly. Okay. So I think my presentation in some ways picks up somewhere between where Perry and Christina have left me in terms of what's inherited and what to do. Just a real quick context about this presentation. This was a research project I did with students in a class that I had at Hamilton College, which is a liberal arts college in upstate New York. And so we together were trying to think about the question of campus sickness, and especially in relationship to the limitations to their curiosity. And here, we're really thinking about capitalism as the inheritance, which is shaping quite a bit of their curiosity. And so what I'm going to do is just read you a quick 10-minute story from this text. The campus is sick. That's what I've been saying for a while now. It's sick, very, very sick. I've just met Adam, a fifth-year senior at Hamilton College, for the first time, and I'm struck by his candor, how quickly he presses into the issue of college mental health. Adam himself has experienced the pressures of college life, eventually taking a year off after experiencing debilitating depression and suicidal ideation after his junior year. He has since recovered and become one of the most vocal advocates for change on Hamilton's campus. Hamilton, like nearly every college and university in the United States, has seen a steady and ever more concerning increase in mental unwellness, which has made the college experience less and less like the utopian visions of an elite liberal education. Millennials, like those at Hamilton's campus, have been characterized as the anxious generation. Nearly 1 out of 3 students experience a depressive state during their college careers, and recent studies have shown that suicidal ideation on university campuses is over 10%, and suicide is now the second leading cause of death for college-age students. But as Adam is indicating here, many students don't see this problem as necessarily located in individual students. Instead, by locating the sickness in the campus, he's suggesting that the problem is environmental and systemic. About the political and economic landscape of university education in the 21st century. The question then is what practices, policies, and cultural values are producing this campus sickness? And it's my argument in this talk that the rapid increase in mental unwellness is actually partially related to the capitalist sociocultural values produced in and by current university systems. These values curtail student curiosity, defined here, in my words, as a knowledge emotion, a feeling we get when we are excited to learn something new. The link between educational success and monetary reward necessarily channels students' curiosity to question monetary reward and success, carrying with it, of course, classed, gendered, and racialized connotations in the form of competitive drive. As a result, students continue to experience an increase in the distance between what they want to know, that is, a self-driven, motivated curiosity, and what they ought to want to know, a capitalist curiosity, which in turn tears them from themselves, producing anxiety, depression, and the like. Now, I want to be clear here that as an anthropologist, I'm not as concerned with the diagnostics of illness, which is incredibly important and a different field entirely. What I am interested in here are the kinds of emotional states that are produced within particular social and cultural milieus. And in this case, the milieu I'm interested in is the university. In the past 20 years, the university has become one of the 2 or 3 most entrenched sites of the modern debt economy, forcing students to think about loan repayment even as they leave college for their first jobs. The rules of business have had several major effects on university students, included, but certainly not limited to these 2. Tuition increases by 35% between 2008 and 2017, and STEM curricula taking primacy over nearly all humanities and social sciences courses, which have slowly eroded the growth of gender, women's, and ethnic studies programs. Now, inevitably, these massive shifts in knowledge value have impacted student learning. Most students come into college already deeply indoctrinated into capitalist knowledge values insofar as they have ideas of achievement, success, and self-worth tied to standardized tests that are calibrated to how they should be productive members of a workforce, supposedly. What students want to know in this context is inevitably forced towards what they ought to want to know. How do I get a job? What courses do I need to take to get there? How do I get the grades I need? Who do I need to know to get ahead? How do I get a leg up on the competition? Curiosity here is commodified. Its purpose and emotional resonance is derived from its ability to facilitate free market capitalism. Now, one of my students, Michael, when we were talking about this, simply shrugged his shoulder and said, "That's life." He went on to tell me that he actually had read about the need for curiosity before our discussions during his job search on recruiter.com, which he pointed out hailed curiosity, though curiosity in this case was essential only for business success because along with creativity, it was the basis for innovation. The fact that curiosity has been commodified was actually paradoxically for Michael, delimiting and inhibiting what he actually was curious about. He went on to say, students are restricted to thinking about their life after college through goals and achievements versus simply the acquisition of knowledge. Idle curiosity is what some might call that. The issue arises when there's unnecessary pressure put on students to find an internship, pick a career, get a job, all while in college. This pressure has the ability to lead kids away from their passions and towards a base level job with minimal connection to their interests. Ultimately, it's this pressure that creates the fatalist and pragmatic individual. To feel a sense of fatality as Michael does, the idea that this is the way that it must be and what we must accept with a shrug, that's life, has major consequences for how students see themselves and their ability to change their surroundings. Later, I sit with John, another Hamilton senior, a few days later, and he starts discussing his own dreams for the future as a musician. John's always asking questions about his craft and areas which might help him towards these goals, whether it was to think mathematically about music or to think about the creative, improvisational sensibility which he sought to unleash in himself. And yet, even as he starts to speak about his future, he stops, and finally says, without prodding, as if to justify his decisions, but I still have marketable skills. Now, it doesn't really matter what these marketable skills might be. It's the fact that John felt the need to justify himself in this way. His reflexive statement that what he wanted in life, what he was curious about learning, was not what he should want. Of course, this kind of splitting of desire from what one should desire is the basis for a lot of anxiety. And it's associated here with whether John is doing the right thing by pursuing his curiosity. Here, a student who exhibits a curiosity that is not already commodified is by nature at risk. For this negation, as any risky class experience, which cannot already be placed neatly into the confines of career goals, needs to be eliminated. I think here we can kind of see some resonances with what Christina is saying about what kind of courses students take and when they ask questions in those courses. Take, for example, Amanda, who was a student who wanted to choose an interdisciplinary major, but found it difficult to do so. When I chose my major, I wanted to declare an interdisciplinary major that involved experiential education, yet I was just beginning to explore this area, so it seemed that I wouldn't be employable without direction. So I declared mathematics so that I could sell myself as a math teacher if I ever needed to. Now I'm in the predicament that the math senior seminar I want to take conflicts with a course I need to take for the education minor. Why, as a sophomore, did I have such difficulty following what I was passionate about? And what I think Amanda is alluding to here is the kind of risk-security paradox that's produced in a capitalist education. When future success, developing the appropriate portfolio, grades, and the like are primary concerns, students are less likely to explore, to be curious, and embed themselves in spaces that may feel less comfortable, less certain, and less related to the future. As such, by not taking risks, students actually fail to develop the very skills during college which would make them feel more secure with the uncertainties that are inevitable in life after college. Indeed, Charlotte doesn't see this as a problem of herself. She actually sees this as an entire college community issue. She says, within this school community, we're rewarded for being the ideal Hamilton student in this case. Amount of sleep becomes a competition. Number of executive positions held becomes a competition. Longest time spent in the library becomes a competition. Doing nothing after class on a Tuesday is an oddity on these campuses, and students are committing themselves to things because they thought that's what they were supposed to do. We're going to work ourselves to a breaking point, and it won't really prepare us for success in the real world. Yes, extra work can lead to extra money, but is that the point of being an adult? In the end, what all this can lead to is an absolute fear of doing anything at all. Another way that students see the campus as a place of sickness rather than health. After telling me that she really dislikes speaking in classrooms because she's so fearful of being judged, Charlotte finally blurts out, I just feel paralyzed. I never want to do anything wrong. The evocation of paralysis, I think, might be one of the best ways of articulating how mental unwellness gets wrapped into the student college experience. Rather than beginning and ending with the kinds of questions that spark her curiosity, Charlotte can't even fathom asking questions anymore, given her fear of failure. I just want to end with a question here as we move to Q&A and discussion. What would college look like if student curiosity in all of its complexity and possibility was foregrounded and facilitated rather than delimited or curtailed? And I'm especially interested in this question in this pandemic's moment, where I think there's almost a requirement that we think differently and ask a different set of questions, namely because our normal expectations aren't what they would be if we were in classroom settings. And secondly, because students aren't quite certain of their future as they thought they might be. So I think we have the opportunity to ignite a new type of curiosity here in this moment and challenge ourselves to push our pedagogic possibilities in a new direction. Thank you.
Great, so I think we're open to discussion.
And I think to run discussion here, we'd love thoughts as much as questions here, things that you all are seeing in your classrooms, ideas of what to do, or questions you have for us, any of those three.
Arjun, you're muted.
I see two raised hands, so maybe we'll start with Karen.
Karan. Yeah.
Then,
Yeah.
so Karan, and then we'll go to, I saw another hand
Craig.
after that. Craig.
Hi, everybody. Gosh, this is a very emotional presentation, I have to say. As a mother, as a teacher here at AU for 8 years, I was in the Department of Literature, now I'm in the Department of Business. And I was a trustee at Williams, my alma mater, which is very similar to Hamilton. Arjun, your first person narrative just really hit my heart because I see how complicit I am in these kinds of practices. And Christina, your beautiful presentation about literature and students who want to do school the right way and ask questions. I mean, it's just an endless system of conformity, isn't it, that we engage with in our students. I was my high school salutatorian and I read a poem about curiosity, and curiosity has always been a North Star for me. As a Foreign Service officer, as a writer, you're just raising some really, really important questions. I'm the mother of 3 sons. We just have a lot of work to do. This is beautiful work. I appreciate it. In my work in the business school, I often talk about the importance of questioning and listening. There's a book called A More Beautiful Question by Warren Berger. It's questioning in the business sense, as one of you mentioned, with this excuse that it leads to innovation, and so there's a capitalist tie-in, right? But it's a nice bridge, especially for our business students at AU, that questioning and listening is not just a nice thing to do or an extra idea, but it can be a core practice in life. And he has a lot of good references at the end of A More Beautiful Question, where he's partnering with an organization called the Right Question Institute. And they have a lot of exercises for educators that I use in my teaching, especially with my MBA students, positing that question storming is more important than brainstorming. So I wanted to throw that out as a resource. And I'm happy to stop now and listen to everybody else. Thank you for this. This is really, this is just really important work. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are amazing comments. Perry, do you have, I have a few thoughts for you. Because in my presentation, it sort of come down hard on, I think, business and business logics to questioning. And the reason for that is not because there is not value there. There's a lot of value there. Students should have jobs after college, right? That's a pragmatic thing. That the issue has become that has closed off their ability to think beyond that. And so if we can expand the sort of range of potential curiosities that we're cultivating in classroom, then that doesn't become such a big net negative, right? It doesn't. And perhaps if we could expand the idea of what could produce that end outcome for students, right? Such that it's not like I need to either go into finance, medicine, or engineering in order to have a positive future for myself, right? What kind of new questions might I ask then? So just to sort of maybe nuance and complicate that story, such that it's not so one-dimensional, but the students definitely feel it. They definitely feel the effects of it.
Yeah, just a quick comment. When Perry complicated this at the beginning with this idea that there's a political aspect here, as long as healthcare coverage, a basic universal right, is connected to employment, there's a very existential reason students will not feel comfortable to be an artist or a writer or musician or dreamer and all those essential things we need in society. And now I really will be quiet and hear other folks. Thank you.
Yeah, I would just add, you brought up the Right Questions Institute, and one of the things that I think is interesting about the brainstorming of the questions is that it values, it's sort of like, it matters just that we get questions up there on the board. And I think there's something really powerful about that. And I also think one of the ways I like to do it is to start talking about what are the values that we as a community of inquiry hold in common that would guide our questions. So I want to kind of balance this. We just need to let the questions loose and value them for what they are, but also recognizing that curiosity is political, that it's affected by social values. What are the values we can cultivate, that we can hold on to, that we can say, this is what will let us determine the kinds of questions that we really want to bring forward? Because I think I'm not yet convinced that all questions are good inherently, or all questions should be pursued. I'm not there, right? I think there are some dangerous questions that are guiding certain functions and projects. So that's just my my battle in my brain with the Right Questions project. But I think what they're doing is also important. So we had other hands. I think Craig was next.
Hi, thanks. No, everything everyone's been talking about. Sorry about that. Everything that everyone's been talking about has been great. A quick question, and then sort of maybe some follow-up on that. Do you view curiosity studies to be a subset of sociology of knowledge, or something that's sort of distinctly different from that, or?
I mean, we see it as an interdisciplinary field, so it wouldn't be a sociological project in particular. It's an interdisciplinary field that sees curiosity as something that we're all using, and therefore something that we all have some insight about what it is.
Right. I mean, sociology of knowledge isn't necessarily strictly just with sociology, but you get my drift. It seems that one of the fields that I've been interested in doing research lately is also linked into this as well, sort of sensory studies, and how there's generally a privilege that is given to sort of the visual sense, and our sort of neglect of the other senses, sort of, keeps us blind in many ways in terms of how we think about our thought process, how we think about being curious, how we think about, how we, the cognition process as well. So it's a lot of these things are very interesting in terms of how they're being intertwined. Regarding something that I guess Arjan had mentioned, I think there's also potentially a socioeconomic dimension of that. Sort of if you look at the dynamic between, say, parents in the university and sort of them imploring, it's like, I want my child to get a job, that type of thing, which is good on one hand, but then it's in some ways has transformed the model of the university into a very different kind of a business model.
Well, Christina, do you want to reply to that?
Well, I was just going to quickly say, I think that is, it's an interesting, as a child of an immigrant, I definitely was that college student who went forward with my own track, even though in middle school I had said I wanted to be a cardiovascular thoracic surgeon. So that was a real turnabout. And I think there is a lot of cost to it. The socioeconomic tight hold on universities is in many ways non-negotiable But I think what both Arjun and Perry have signaled, and what I've seen in my own classrooms, is that it doesn't have to overdetermine the ways in which we teach our students. In fact, there will be no CEOs in our classrooms for the majority of the time, and hopefully if Zoom can have some sort of pedagogical integrity, we won't have, watchful eyes. And that gives us, every classroom scene, I think, has an incredible opportunity. We always talk about teaching moments, I think, but often the classroom becomes as much of a learning space for the professor as for the students. And so in that regard, I was thinking a bit with someone that Perry had cited in the presentation, Fred Moten, and he was a really great thinker of what we can do in our classrooms that is not necessarily the agenda of overdetermined sort of business models of learning. And I think the best science classrooms, the best business classrooms, the best humanities classrooms do harness that potential. And I think one of the questions of the sensory is, when are we over relying on the visual when we need to be attending to the oral? And this also affects the ways in which we teach neurodiverse learners as well. So that was just my rambling thought pattern. Arjun?
No, that was great. Maybe I'll pick up right where you left off with the sensory part here, and maybe go back to what Curiosity Studies does differently. When we think about disciplines, we think about methods. And so for somebody trained as an anthropologist, I'm trained in the sort of fetish of ethnography and being there, right? I learn through a process of exposure to other people, dialogue, and analyzing those kind of interactions. Now, that's limited because, as Christina's told us in her presentation, there's a different methodology that might be in excess of the fetish of being there, right? The fetish of that moment. And if we take any of these two paradigms as the paradigm, then we're actually limiting curiosity, right? We're actually limiting our ability to ask new questions in new ways. And so that's what Curiosity Studies as a paradigm offers us, right? What does it mean when we bring in the methodologies and the approaches to curiosity of an engineer in tandem with the ways of asking questions about curiosity of somebody from comp lit or philosophy or anthropology? And so it's not necessarily a sociology of knowledge framework, but it certainly does change the way that we think about the episteme.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would just add that when you said that the kind of curiosity brought by an engineer, I mean, I think that I want to think about science, even science itself, as having a number of traditions. And there are particular sorts of questions that are privileged in different disciplines, specifically in Western science, and many of these are challenged within their own disciplines, but also through indigenous science, for example, or feminist science studies, and that all knowledge, right, is always in flux and in struggle. And I think part of what I wanted to communicate was that our job is to help students navigate that, right? Not learn a bunch of things, because that stuff is going to change in the next 10, 20 years. And we're all trying to keep up, right? So it's not learning something, it's learning how to navigate that knowledge itself moves. And how do they want to be the movers of knowledge? Catherine, I think you might be next.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I want to say this is an absolutely brilliant topic. This has got to be one of my most favorite sessions that I've had in a very long time. So thank you all for your incredible brilliance in bringing it to us and sharing it. So I think of curiosity from kind of a body way, in the sense that if you look at animals and you're trying to figure out which animal that you're looking at is healthy, the way that you know is they stretch. So stretching is actually a manifestation of physical health. And my sense is that for human beings, curiosity is also a manifestation of health, of integration, nervous system, all those things. So I think that this whole idea has a lot of really important implications. I think it's important to recognize that for folks, when they're asked about when they're asked to be curious, you have to be careful because you may actually be asking them to do something that in their current state is pretty challenging for them, especially during COVID. So I think it's important to, I mean, curiosity is, to me, so critically important for everything, and especially teaching. But I try to set it up in a way that recognizes their whole experience when they walk into the classroom. And so I think it's, and so what I do specifically is I try to reinforce the value of it to me by having that manifest in the class. So providing questions at the end of readings, all they have to do is provide the questions. They don't get graded on the questions. It's engaging in that experience. So I try to take the burden off of doing some other things to incorporate the idea that it's a really worthwhile thing in this class to do this other thing, which is to be curious, and to not talk about it in terms of getting the right answer, but rather this is the opportunity to explore what you know relative to the expertise in the room, right? So there's stuff like that. But I'm really interested in what other things you would suggest, you three would suggest, and others on the session here, for how to actually manifest that in a meaningful way for students in the classroom, because this is such a non-dominant idea, right? And especially in science, I'm in biology, we actually have to get information transferred to our students to have for their next class. It's a very sequential, knowledge-based progression. So the question is, how do you do both? And what are the ways that you can sort of incorporate that in a meaningful way? So thank you very much. I'm really appreciating this.
Everyone, you want to start? Well, okay, I'll say a few things to start then. I had so thinking about your question, Catherine, one of the most privileged moments of teaching in the university context was when I got to teach a class on curiosity. And, you know, so this is, again, I recognize that this rarely happens for me when we're teaching required courses, et cetera, right? But the one insight that I gained from that course more than anything else was that the most maybe intriguing way of shifting how students feel about their learning is a kind of consciousness raising about curiosity, that they're being curious. A lot of times what happens because of the way that we're teaching facts all the time or teaching content all the time is they lose that critical awareness that they're actually being curious at these moments. So that consciousness raising alone actually shifts the way that they're organizing themselves towards their learning, which was, so for me, very profound. And it seems kind of basic, but in fact, that scaffolding of you're actually asking questions right now, or you're doing this constantly, and then becoming aware of that changes things a lot. The second thing I'll say kind of connects back to Craig in a way, which is to think about multimodality. I didn't say this in the beginning, but I'm a visual anthropologist and filmmaker as well. And one of the things that I recognize is that we always recognize is that students learn differently, right? They use different modalities to explore. And so when we have opportunities, not just to engage in a lecture style, which we sort of did here, but also, you know, visually, orally, kinesthetically, that actually is a part of that embodied process of learning. So I try to make sure that we have at least, and in fact, in the assignments, I pretty much give at least 6 or 7 different possible approaches to a final assignment wherever I can, all the while still trying to make sure that there's a way of assessing the content, right? I'll stop there.
Christina, any thoughts?
I'll just say that really quickly that one of the things that's been absolutely fascinating for me as a lit teacher has been when I was able to teach a class with them out of the Princeton Art Museum. And what I noticed is that there really is a difference when students are thinking and moving. So whether they're walking or using any, like moving with a chair or anything in that regard, the possibility that they're not at a desk and that they can't reference text, it's just them and whatever we're examining. There's a kind of freedom there and an undisciplining, which is interesting because it's a museum. So there's all kinds of cues of how to look. And, you know, there's a little placard that tells you what you're supposed to think about the piece. But that moment of taking one kind of relation, right, the written word, and then when I move students into the museum in week 4 or week 5, there's an explosion when we think about the terms that we've been thinking about in a classroom or in novels or in poetry or in theory, and then when we're in front of a piece of visual art or a performance or something of that in that regard. And I think this speaks to the ways in which curiosity flourishes in that multimodality across disciplines, and as perhaps a kind of, I think one of our, Carol, was it you that said stretching? There's a kind of like interdisciplinary sort of flexing and stretching and experimentation and unassuredness, because I haven't taught them anything about visual rhetoric or visual rhetorical analysis at that point. And there's a liberty in that, because it seems like it almost seems like it's not a part of the class, but it is, right? And it has a different kind of movement to it. So that's one of many different little stretches that I can think of.
Yeah, as with Arjun, I've also taught a few classes on curiosity, and one of the ways in which I've begun the class has typically been, when was the last time you were curious, and kind of write it down, and then we'll kind of share stories. And it blew my mind that most of them said a couple weeks back. A few of them said a couple years back. They were like, that was the last time I was curious, and they described it. There was only maybe 1 or 2 who was like, this morning I wondered blah, blah, blah. And I think it's true that as the course went on, they were more attuned to when they were actually curious, and that it was more often than they thought. But also usually in that opening moment of the class, I would say sort of when has curiosity sort of showed up for you? When have you heard the word? When did someone ask a question that you were like, oh yeah, okay, that's a good one. When does that happen for you? Suddenly, I think curiosity became this much bigger practice in which they're engaged far more regularly and more robustly and more outside of school than inside of school. And that, I think that actually, there was a feedback loop into the class itself, such that they asked more unusual questions, brought in more of their outside life into the text and back out than in my other classes. So those are 2 things I tried.
Quick activity that I love to do with students, again, having to do with the cameras, which is thinking about what you said, Perry, just got my brain working again, which is the students will walk from their dorm room to the classroom. We don't do that now, right? But at the time they would. And that seems like the least interesting walk ever, right? You're walking from your dorm, you've done it an infinite number of times. But what I would start having them do is each time just take a photograph on the way, something you're curious about. And what ends up happening is they realize that trip is inexhaustible, right? In terms of how many different kinds of things they might be able to capture within the frame, right? And that's sort of just a quick way of instigating a recognition of one's curiosity, right? That it was always there. We just have sort of dimmed our observational possibilities.
Mm.
Other comments, questions?
I had another comment, if you don't mind my sort of piping in. One thing that I think is really that should be investigated is the relationship between curiosity and a sense of wonder. When you look at sort of curiosity, you sort of look into this, for many people, the discourse of rationality. When you look into a sense of wonder, many people sort of think about it in the context of a magical worldview. And so, whereas the former is acceptable, the latter is not. But very often, sort of that sort of discourse has not been privileged, and sort of because of issues of curiosity. So let me give you an example. There's a storm coming, and the animals, the birds, the dogs start acting very, very erratically. Before, we might think that's folk wisdom in terms of, this is what's happening. Mm-hmm. But now we sort of know that that's probably a function of barometric pressure.
Mhm.
So in the context of curiosity and sort of the different sort of worldviews, we don't necessarily always have the tools to understand and to investigate. We don't sort of have the license, the curiosity to sort of to look into these things because they're not viewed as appropriate within sort of the rational discourse. And that especially sort of deals with issues regarding mental health.
Yeah, I'll just add a quick historical point, and then I'll kind of hand it over here to Arjun. But there's a wonderful book by Lorraine Daston called Wonder and the Orders of Nature, I believe.
Oh yeah, yeah.
And one of the things that she points out there is that the relationship between wonder and curiosity flipped in the early modern period. So wonder was really the better thing to have. Specifically, it was related to spirituality and to an appreciation of a more than human, more than material world. And curiosity was something practiced by sort of lower class people. They're just kind of distracted. They're not very educated. They're interested in lots of things that don't really matter. And those are the curious folks. So you wanted to be a wondering person. You wanted to be not a curious person. And all of that flips in the early modern period such that curiosity becomes the marker of the educated, specifically a secular education, someone who can lead a secular civil society. And wonder, which is still aligned with a kind of spiritual attunement, is aligned also with precisely what you're saying, someone whose rationality is under kind of suspicion at the time. But in both cases, the play of which one matters more is about class. And that's really intriguing. I think it suggests to us how are we talking about curiosity today? What are the like really common, oh, that's what curiosity looks like, and how is that privileging a certain class of people, such that, for instance, our first gen students come in and they feel like they can't prove their curiosity. It doesn't get recognized.
Mhm.
They're missing out on something. They don't know how to perform it. So it ends up kind of coming back to us. How are we replicating a class status in our curiosity celebrations?
And it's around that time where they're sort of making that flip-flop between curiosity and wonder, where sort of the people who are in the upper class are sort of having these curiosity cabinets, sort of getting things from the new world and objectifying what these people and these places that they're meeting, you know, sort of using that rational discourse, you know, to objectify people who are Native Americans or what have you, so.
Arjun, did you want to say something?
You go first.
I just wanted to add one other term to the conversation, which would be imagination. I think that one of the things that one of the thinkers that I had brought up in my presentation, Glissant, he says with the poetics of relation, or with a sort of sensorial relationship to relation itself, one of the things that's afforded is the possibility of imagination. And I think that's something that curiosity can help cultivate in its best pursuits in our classrooms, because the question of questionings also leads to the possibility that we don't have to reproduce the world that we have, that we could imagine something quite different. Arjun?
I mean, I love that. I was thinking a lot about opacity too in this regard, in relations with curiosity during your presentation, which is, and Perry sort of hinted at this too when we were thinking about the limitations of questioning and when we ought not to ask a question, precisely because of the way that curiosity has been completely cultivated in this neat colonial rationalist sense, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the second thing that I was thinking about, and I think what we're trying to do in curiosity studies in some ways is to find a way away from the Cartesian dualism that sort of prevented us from taking curiosity seriously, right? When I say knowledge emotion, I'm thinking about feeling, right? And feeling is in a dual sense. Feeling seems to be an internal thing, but it's also literal touch, right? Those two things might be one and the same. Mm-hmm. And so if we take curiosity from that starting point, it might look a little more like wonder than we oftentimes think of it as. So I think that's certainly where we're where we're moving with a lot of this work. I was going to say something else and I forgot, but we'll leave it at that. Class, totally, right? You know, when I'm talking about capitalist curiosity, we're talking about a system that's privileged a particular kinds of knowledge, which has been tethered historically in the United States to rich white men, right? That's what that knowledge is about. So when we're trying to deconstruct capitalist curiosity, we're in some ways trying to deconstruct that. And in the longer paper, I talk a lot more about the position of you know, female presenting individuals who basically are constantly anxious because of this competitive drive and don't see themselves. Either you inhabit a more masculinist sense of what success looks like, or you fall out of the trappings of what success could look like. You know, so I think these kind of things have to be historically situated if we're going to think about what the university has been and what it continuously is. I was talking to my student yesterday about you know, places like Georgetown, American, Hamilton, and it's still the case that over 70% of the students who go to these schools come from, you know, the top 20% SES brackets, right? So like, we're really still talking about elite education for the elites. And without positioning the conversation of curiosity within that, at least in the university, we're missing.
Yeah, I want to be conscious of time. I know that we wrap up here in less than a minute. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for your comments and questions, and check out Curiosity Studies, available online. Yeah, so just thanks.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much.